One of the early thoughts was the critique of notice and choice. Clearly, everybody on every side of the privacy spectrum has issues with notice and choice, and do they work, and are they ignored, and do they just provide a shifting of focus, but aren't really meaningful. But other privacy critics, in reacting to the paper or the concept, have said, are you proposing to eliminate individual participation here? Am I going to therefore get marketing without being able to decide? I mean, where and how are we minimizing or taking off the table, or are we disrespecting to some degree a core concept of users having an important measure of control? So would you give us a reaction to that? And
yeah, it's one of the themes that in thinking about what would be interesting to advance this is, I'll call it messaging, which I will touch on that. But let me first give you a little bit more of a background on how we got to this stage, and then finish with something around risk, although different than perhaps what Richard talked to you yesterday, which I think is relevant to this audience. So Fred talked about 18 months ago, the seven of us locking ourselves in a very, very, very nice hotel to think about what this new world would look like. But the journey really started 2.5 years prior to that, where as part of kind of our looking at the world, our being Microsoft's view of the world, we said, look, all the things that Fred talked about are likely to come in play, and what implications would that have? And that started us on a journey that we called a global dialogue, which involved over 100 privacy experts, ranging from academics to advocacy organizations to policymakers to regulations in all 5 different parts of the world. We chose not to go to Antarctica as one continent for perhaps obvious reasons, but touched on just about every other part of the world. There were then a global summit that we hosted on Microsoft campus involving some 70 people. And I would say that the conclusion was that from those experts that the current model that we have grown up with and built with some very, very noble right purposes was not working today, and certainly was not working tomorrow. And I come from kind of an operational background. By extension, if the process is broken, one must find a new process. So in other words, the conclusion was almost no one felt that we didn't need some change. The question was, to what change, which is where we started doing much of this work that Fred talked about. This got to, I'll call it, the key theme of messaging, because what's interesting about change is that despite, I think, people intellectually, perhaps even emotionally recognizing that we need to evolve to something better, or we could do better, to what is a paradigm that is uncomfortable for many of us. In other words, we don't know what the answer is, but discovery of that answer can create some emotions about it. So what we learned out of this is that some messaging challenges with Fred suggesting perhaps a shift more to a use of information. Some people interpret it as, well, that means consent's gone. Or another one, if we're going to have more accountability on data stewards, many of us in this room, well, that means all the other fair information principles are gone. Well, of course, none of that is accurate, but it's just this messaging challenge. And this got me thinking about, I'll call it the risk side of things too for this audience. This is actually the first time that this group has actually exposed this work to a group of privacy professionals. And so when I think about risk, Fred said something that is, for us, as I'll call it, data custodian stewards of organizations, he's really saying this model requires us to assume more responsibility. And intellectually, that sounds good. Intellectually, I suspect there will be people in our organizations that would say, hold on a sec. Consent may not work, but after all, that's how we offload most of our risk onto our unsuspecting customers. Well, okay, so you can argue about that. It says that's just a bad deal for consumers, therefore should be changed. But I'm going to present an alternative view to you, all as, I'll call it that, custodians, the organizations. To think that we can maintain the status quo also has extreme risk. Because I think what we will see is, as this model increasingly comes under stress, the natural cycle of public policy will take place, and we will see reactions to that breakdown of that. And I'm not sure that we'll all be happy with what those outcomes are. So I think it behooves us to think very differently, pragmatically. I think it behooves us to think differently about our roles, to accept more responsibility for that, to unburden the consumer. But to Jules' final question, this does not mean that the individual should not participate. In a strange sort of way, if we find the right solution, will in effect make consent more meaningful, because it will apply to places where it really is important, as opposed to the grad bag, as Christopher said. If you read this treaty longer than Hamlet and click I agree, everything's just fine. And that's just probably not sustainable. So we all have a responsibility to think about a different model.
So the critique that, well, I'll be getting all these marketing messages because someone has decided that that's low risk. I'm still likely to have options to
Absolutely.
make decisions, but the more nuanced public good type decisions, or this is a use for analytics, which a user really maybe isn't in a good position to be seriously debating and considering. We need the policymakers, the thoughtful stewards to say, you know what, this isn't a time to request a consent. It won't ever be meaningful. We need responsible thinkers to say, this is something that should always be happening. It's in the benefit of the individual, benefit of society. Here, this is a discretionary thing. Somebody should be asked to tick a box or not. Is that a fair?
For all good intentions, we collectively, those of us here, those of us there, those of us on both sides of the Atlantic, have created the Hamlet-style privacy notices. We've said, wow, individual needs to be in control. The way they get control is to be more transparent. That means that it's 80,000 words and everything's just fine. And we've sleepwalked a little bit into thinking that even, for example, obvious uses of information, I'm going to provide you with my address because I'd actually like the package that I ordered from Amazon to be delivered, which is part of that 80,000 treaty-like notice, is part of the whole deal. And we should think about that and say, well, yeah, that maybe should be discoverable, but it shouldn't be part of the click I agree notion that covers every single terms of use, including parts of information use that might really apply to fundamental human rights. We've got to, I think, just think differently about, I'll call it mixing up the pieces so that it provides a more effective model. But it absolutely still means that the individual has some control, some choice, just the model where it really does apply.